Hi there, this is Erica Merrill, and I am the founder of Perfect Legal Video. And it is Friday afternoon, and we will be interviewing one of my favorite attorneys, Brian Jones, about an incredibly interesting topic. We're going to be talking about um, Jeffrey Epstein's island and his sex trafficking ring. So, thank you so much, Brian, for joining us this afternoon. We're very excited to hear what you have to say about these topics.
Always a pleasure, Erica. How are you today?
I'm doing great, thanks. So I guess let's just jump right into it. What made the Epstein sex trafficking scandal different from other sex trafficking that we hear about?
I think the biggest thing that brought it to the attention of the media was his wealth, power, and position. Um, Combine that with the wealthy nature and the high level of stature and prominence of those people that spent time with him and are allegedly also participants in that trafficking ring, made it really easy to sensationalize, brought it to the attention of the public. And so that's the reason it got so much widespread media attention. Sex trafficking in general has also gained national prominence for a variety of reasons, up to and including the Me Too movement. So these topics are becoming hotter and hotter, and when you add in the celebrity factor, it created a media hurricane.
You know, yeah, I definitely get that. It's something that is riveting. People are tuning into it. I guess one question I would have, and I know that there's a few answers to it, but um, why would someone who is so rich and famous and just, literally like he was, I think he already had a lot of other scandals going on. Why would he bother with having this large sex trafficking operation?
Well, Erica, I'm not aware of any specific psychological studies that were conducted on Jeffrey Epstein in particular. What I can speak to is generalities regarding people who engage in this sort of behavior. Now, oftentimes these individuals have some sort of underlying mental health issue that causes them to either be unable to interact with other adults on a traditional social basis. They have predilections and paraphilias geared towards power situations and having power over their sex partners. And some people are just evil-hearted, and they have a desire to subjugate and use other individuals for their own personal pleasure.
That is interesting you say that, because in some of the research that I've done in preparing for this interview, they say that they had not seen anything in his upbringing where he was abused. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not there, but they didn't see anything like that. There were no stories. So yeah, maybe it was just a preference he had, and it's something he was feeding. But was also he was also surrounded by rich and famous people. And as a salesperson, as a lifelong salesperson, I know that you can really sweeten the deal. And there were some reports that mentioned that having young girls as part of closing deals was his usual business practice, which is really interesting.
Well, and I think you hit on another possible reason why Mr. Epstein would engage in this sort of behavior, is because while his initial dipping his toes into these waters was possibly for a personal desire or personal predilection, what he saw in other people was that he could leverage their interest in these sorts of behaviors into benefits for himself. And when we talk about sex trafficking, that's what the people who are at the top of that organization often identify, is that they can leverage other people's paraphilias, other people's sex interests into benefits for themselves. At the lowest level, you're talking about individuals, let's call a spade, a pimp, who sees people out on the street, people who are interested in engaging in sex for money. And so, that individual then builds up a group of women who he can traffic into the community and profit from those sex acts. Just like any other business owner would have a team of employees out selling their wares. The person at the top of that pyramid then gains profit from exploiting the paraphilias and predilections of their customers.
So let me back up, because I know you're partially answering this question that I wanted to ask next. But just to make sure that we get it correct, we're talking about sex trafficking, but prostitution is different. And the lines can be blurred, and it seems that they were on, it's a case-by-case basis, but some of these women have come forward and told their stories, and some people may judge this as a job that they had. So if you could just back up and give us your definition of, or what is the difference between prostitution and sex trafficking?
Absolutely, Erica. So prostitution is the individual act. It's the transaction of a sex act in exchange for money. I suppose you could barter anything for a sex act, and that would be considered prostitution. The idea and the concept of sex trafficking is the managerial aspect of it added onto the individual transaction. So somebody watching over, booking appointments, or obviously scheduling and enforcing the prostitute into those sex acts, either through threats of violence, through control over their financial situation, or in some other manner. I would say that even the withholding of love and affection from one individual to another would be the kind of force that could be considered a sex trafficking situation. But to be more specific, Erica, the difference between prostitution and sex trafficking is that additional act of a second individual who is forcing the prostitute into the sex act, into the financial transaction.
So it's a difference between being there voluntarily and not.
Exactly. And there's a modern movement of sex positivity, sweeping the world, and some people choose to engage in sex acts for a living. And I'm not here to judge or say that what they're doing is right or wrong. In Ohio, it's illegal. In some locations, it's legal. The difference is, just like any sort of involuntary servitude, we as a society have said, you shouldn't be forced to do something. You shouldn't be forced to do something you don't want. And if you're going to do something for a form of employment, you should be paid an appropriate wage and compensated for that.
Heck, maybe there's even a 401k and a health plan.
Erica, I don't know for sure, but what I do know is that some of the brothels, particularly in Las Vegas, are very lucrative businesses. They run their businesses very, very strictly. They have protocols and procedures. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there are some fringe benefits.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I know that HBO had a show on that was kind of a reality show many years ago now, but they've been legal out there for quite some time, and from what it looks like, people are there voluntarily. So it's not the situation that we're talking about here, which I think probably was mixed between people that wanted to be there doing that, and maybe there were some people that were forced, certainly in the underage area, which we can get into in a moment. There's one more thing I'd like you to define before we move on, and that is RICO, RICO. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know that you said that you've been involved in some of those cases.
Sure, Erica. So RICO stands for Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations. It's a specific federal statute that essentially prohibits organized crime. Under Ohio law, it's called engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity. Now, what's necessary for one of these indictments or a charge of this nature is that a group of people come together and plan out and execute a crime or a series of crimes. And the only reason they've come together is for that criminal purpose. So two people who might engage in a robbery could go to a liquor store, rob the liquor store, and leave with the profits, and they've committed a robbery, but they've not committed a violation of the RICO statute or Ohio's engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity. This has to be an ongoing plan that is for an express criminal purpose. So that plan can be pretty broad. It can also be very narrow. It doesn't necessarily have to be multiple criminal acts, but the express purpose of the interaction between the people has to be for that criminal purpose. And oftentimes law enforcement and prosecutors identify a group of people who are engaging in criminal activity, but that's not their primary purpose. Like I said, two buddies that happen to decide to knock off a liquor store one night are not organized crime. That's not the mafia. But at the same time, those two buddies who decide together that they are going to purchase, break down, and sell drugs over a long period of time could be a racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organization, or engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity. So when we're talking about these sex trafficking rings, if the express purpose of these individuals coming together is for the purpose and business of sex trafficking, that would fall under the RICO statute. But on the other hand, if it's a one-off transaction, then we're probably not looking at that sort of charge, but we're looking at one count of sex trafficking or one count of prostitution.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. Now, when we're talking about, some of the crimes we were talking about last week that had to do with assault and battery and second offenses and that sort of thing, and not fighting hard to get off the first time and not thinking it's a big deal. I mean, you really explained that as sometimes the accuser kind of is the puppeteer then, and she has a lot of control over the person she's accusing if she's falsely accusing, just to get back at him or to gain control of the situation. Well, there is an aspect of that that we've spoken about when it comes to prostitution, where somebody was there to do a job, and they were basically not paid, or they weren't happy with the situation for whatever reason. You've made several of those points earlier here, but could you be accused of rape, for example, if you didn't pay your prostitute?
So Erica, we have represented a handful of clients who have found themselves in that situation. One particular client had engaged in a transaction of money for sex, and after the sex act was completed, the prostitute asked for more money and tried to extort him for more funds. And when he refused or was unable to come up with those funds, she then went to law enforcement and claimed that the sex act was involuntary and that it was rape. We have also had the more insidious situation where the John refused to pay after the sex act, and the prostitute then went to law enforcement and claimed rape. When you have that voluntary transaction, that may be a crime under Ohio law of prostitution or solicitation on the part of the John. However, the sex act itself is not a rape or a sexual battery, because the sex act was voluntary. It was voluntary contingent on the desire to receive money, but it was still voluntary. I'm sorry, Erica, go ahead.
Sorry, no. So it was consensual, right? I mean, they wanted to do it. They were getting paid, and they weren't forced, is the point.
Exactly. It's all about consent when you're talking about rape.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting, and I love that, like, these definitions you've just given us really kind of lay the groundwork. Now, I absolutely believe that, Jeffrey Epstein is an evil, horrible person. Um, but just looking at it from, an outsider, just trying to figure out where the lines were blurred. And there were so many cases that I'm sure that some of these are going to fall on the lines of sex trafficking and some of them prostitution. But it's just an interesting way to think of it when you look at what was really going on. I mean, some of these women were getting flown around the world to spend time with the rich and famous. And, then later on saying that, you know, they didn't like what happened when they were there. Um, but you see them smiling in so many pictures and they don't look forced. And I mean, and they don't really look drugged or drunk. So I don't know. There could be another way to think of it in certain situations. There are so many cases that you can't just make a blanket statement. But it's just it's definitely a point that we're bringing up. So can you talk a little bit about a pyramid scheme? I don't know if you've seen anything like that come through your doors, where somebody gets accused of pulling someone in to situations that they don't want to be in.
Yeah, absolutely, Erica. And I think you touched on what I think is the hallmark of these situations. You don't know just from looking at an individual whether they've been trafficked or whether they voluntarily engaged in prostitution. And that's where these cases, the allegations against Jeffrey Epstein, the allegations against anybody that's involved in an organization that the business is exchanging sex for money. Those individuals that are engaging in the sex acts themselves have the opportunity to extort or exploit the people that are managing and setting their schedules, because what they can say is, well, I was put in this situation involuntarily. Um, and when you talk about the pyramid aspect of the Jeffrey Epstein case or any of these situations, the allegations in the Epstein situation are that he had individuals out seeking young women, underage women, to engage in sex acts with him and his wealthy and powerful friends. Now, that act in and of itself, depending on where it occurs, may not be a crime at all. What it seems is that these acts were occurring in mostly New York and Florida, neither of which have legalized prostitution. But you could certainly, as an employer in a jurisdiction that has legalized prostitution, recruit individuals to work for your business. Now, the difference in the Epstein case is obviously the places where he was doing that prostitution was illegal, and oftentimes the individuals he was recruiting were not old enough to consent to sexual activity. And that's, again, where these cases really become difficult, and there's the possibility that people who portray themselves as victims can actually be individuals who are making false or erroneous accusations against other people because of that consent element. If they engaged in the prostitution act of their own free will, they weren't drugged, they weren't underage, they weren't put under threat of physical violence, they weren't otherwise exploited to engage in the sex act, were they in fact trafficked? And that is the grand question in these cases. Now, in the Epstein situation, we certainly know that many of those individuals were underage. Some of these individuals say that they were drugged. They weren't engaging in this voluntarily. So I agree with you, Erica. Jeffrey Epstein is likely a monster. Only God will be able to judge him. But there are people that are being accused of this crime every day. And the question is this an allegation that's being made for a vindictive purpose, for a financial motivation, or is this a true allegation? And that's where we as defense attorneys come in, because we're going to do that thorough investigation and figure out, is this a situation where somebody was forced into a sex act? Or is this a situation where somebody regrets making a decision to start engaging in these acts voluntarily and now is using the law to get themselves out of that bad choice?
Yeah, but absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is when they were talking about the pyramid scheme and recruiting, as you put it, which is, basically what it is, you're going out there and you're making the job seem awesome. I mean, a lot of times these girls were brought in, I guess, to be his personal masseuse, and then they get in the room and they're saying that the situation changed. It turned into a sex act. Um, and some of them were promised, opportunities to advance their career, make money, be with the rich and famous. Um, how do these things play into a case that you might be involved in?
Well, Erica, we have essentially a four-step process that we handle all of our cases through. Step one is the initial intake of the information from the client. Step two is discovering all of the information that's in the hands of the government. Step three is that independent investigation that we bring to the table that I think a lot of attorneys really overlook. Um, and that's where this comes in for these cases, is we want to do that thorough investigation. Um, Step four is, of course, bringing all that information back to the client and giving them a thorough analysis of what evidence is reliable, what evidence is admissible, and how that evidence is going to play into the presentation to a jury who's ultimately going to decide their fate. When we're doing that investigation, we want to look at the broader picture. And there's no appropriate situation to blame a victim of any sex crime. That is absolutely inappropriate. Somebody who's actually been victimized in that manner absolutely deserves all of the benefits and respect that they can possibly receive. But when we're investigating these sorts of things, we want to make sure that we look at the entirety of their life. Is this something that they engage in on a regular basis? And now they're making an allegation against our particular client. And what is the motivation behind that allegation? And so that thorough investigation is what really needs to be done. And of course, law enforcement doesn't have a motive to do that. Their motive is to find evidence to prove the guilt of the person that they intend to accuse, arrest, and indict. And that's, in my opinion, the biggest failing of modern law enforcement. It used to be, when you talk about, the Andy Griffiths of the world, they would go out and they would do an investigation and they would look at both sides of the story. They would gather up all the evidence and then make a decision as to whether somebody's responsible or not of a particular criminal allegation. What we find today more and more is that law enforcement and the prosecutors that prosecute the crimes that they get brought aren't looking at the full picture. They're not doing a thorough investigation. They're doing a one-sided investigation. And what we want to do is make sure that we do both sides of that investigation. Now, if that investigation reveals that this was a criminal sex act, this was a criminal sexual assault, then what we want to do is we want to move into a phase of mitigation of that behavior and reducing it and making sure that it doesn't happen in the future. But if our investigation reveals that there are ulterior motives, that there is a reason why somebody might try to blackmail their sex work boss, then we want to make sure that we present that evidence in an open forum to objective jurors who can make a decision as to what's true and what's not true.
That is really well said. Thank you so much for that. I do have one last question. Just interested in the fact that as this came up, lots of famous people were shown in pictures with Jeffrey Epstein, and they were mentioned as people that were involved, but no one has been brought to court on that. I mean, nobody has been accused, and I'm sure that that's why he was murdered before anything else came out and before he was really questioned on his, well, I guess they weren't clients, but kind of doing favors for people, and maybe you still call it a client. Why wouldn't they research some of these people, besides money? And I'm sure that's the answer, but what do you think about it?
Erica, I think that these people were probably investigated. And what the result of that investigation was that even a one-sided investigation didn't come up with enough evidence to support bringing criminal charges against them. The other thing is that these individuals are wealthy, and so they likely engaged counsel. So they talked to an attorney, and that attorney then did the proper investigation and turned that result over to law enforcement. This is a strategy that we have taken on a number of cases successfully for clients of our firm. They become aware that somebody's making an allegation against them. We reach out to law enforcement and say, hey, before you arrest somebody, before you incarcerate them, before you ruin their reputation, why don't you give us a chance to provide you our side of the story? And that has two benefits. First, it shows law enforcement that my client's not going to run, that they want to participate in the investigation, and that they don't have anything to hide. Second, it creates a very real opportunity before the media has gotten a hold of a case, before my client's life has been ruined, and before that one-sided narrative gets really ground into law enforcement and prosecutors to present the other side of the story. And frequently we are able to avoid charges altogether because that investigation is conducted. It's turned over to the decision makers who decide whether to indict a case or to reject a case. And the reality is that investigation shows reasonable doubt at a minimum, and sometimes actual innocence. And when we have those situations, we find those to be the biggest of successes because our client never has to face that indictment, that charging instrument that really can damage an individual's reputation. So why were these individuals not charged? I think probably because a thorough investigation revealed that there wasn't enough evidence to convict them. And the consequences of bringing a criminal indictment without probable cause was too damaging to the prosecutors and the law enforcement officers who might have been pursuing those charges in the first place.
Wow, that's really great that you're able to do that for your clients because, boy, as we've discussed in some of our past interviews, you can't undo the damage of someone's reputation sometimes, no matter how much you try and no matter how much it's apparent that charges were dropped. Once you plant that seed in the public's mind, it's just out there, and it may really have a lot of damaging effects on somebody's financial, personal, family life, all aspects. And so that's really fantastic that you're proactive when you get a case like this in making sure you control the investigation to start, and you can almost prove that it's a big waste of time if it is in fact a big waste of time.
Exactly, Erica. And to be perfectly candid, we have had situations where our investigation revealed that these charges were appropriate. And in those situations, we were able to work with our client very early in the process to, again, start that mitigation. We want to engage in behavioral modification to make sure that that individual doesn't commit that crime in the future. And then when the case does open and when they get before a judge, we can show the judge that they don't need to lock this individual up in order to teach them right from wrong. We have already done that for the judge. And so then what we're only talking about is what's the appropriate level of punishment.
Well, that sounds like you save a lot of time as well, which can mean money. So is there anything else you'd like to mention about this particular topic this week? The answers you've given were, fascinating and thorough. So I know there's so much to it. We could probably have several interviews on this particular case. But are there any other snapshots that you'd like to give us?
Well, I think the most important snapshot from this situation is the importance of reaching out and talking to an attorney very early in the process. For those individuals who are satellites around Jeffrey Epstein, I believe that that worked out very well for them. And charges that may have been brought and leverage that may have been put upon them ultimately never came to bear. And I would venture a guess, based on my own personal experience, that their attorney fees were substantially reduced because they reached out and spoke with an attorney as soon as they knew that they might be under investigation. And so, as always, Erica, I would encourage anybody who thinks that they are under investigation or knows that they are under investigation to immediately book an appointment with an attorney, consult with that attorney, be candid with that attorney, share all the information that you have so that the attorney can then take that, expand on the investigation, and make some early decisions about the merits of the case so that you're not wasting time and legal fees down the road when you're now under the pressures of a court schedule, a looming trial date, and in some situations having your name splashed in the newspaper. Avoid all of those things. Get to an attorney as soon as possible.
Absolutely. And as always, I would encourage people in your area to call you because through all of these interviews, it's so apparent about your expertise and your thorough investigations that help get the best outcome for your clients. And you really are looking for all of the information that they need to help them make the right decisions and where to go, because there's so many ways you can go and decisions you need to make when it comes to a court case with some of these criminal charges. And so it helps to have an intelligent and someone that's in court every single day fighting for these things and has that experience in your corner. So please give the Office of Brian Jones a call if you or anyone you know even has an inkling that they might be investigated or might be in trouble. Better to stay ahead of it, just like Brian says.
Thank you for those kind words, Erica.
You are welcome. I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us again this week. We're looking forward to talking to you next week and, on another interesting topic, I'm sure. And, have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too, Erica. Take care.